The road to Blue Fern Lake was nothing more than a narrow, winding path lined with overgrown trees and echoes of memories Claire Bennett thought she had buried. As her car rumbled over the uneven gravel, she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. The trees closed in around her, tall and silent, as if watching her return with quiet judgment. She hadn't been here in over a decade. To anyone else, it might have looked like just another forgotten lakeside cottage, hidden deep in the woods, too far from town to be convenient. But to Claire, it was a place that had once held everything: childhood laughter, her mother's gentle voice, the scent of paint and pine. And then one rainy night it had held loss too heavy to speak of. She had told herself this trip was temporary, just a visit, a practical decision to assess the cottage before deciding whether to sell it. But deep down, she knew better. Some places weren't meant to be left behind forever. Some memories didn't fade, no matter how far you tried to run. When the cottage finally came into view, nestled at the edge of the still, glassy lake, Claire felt her breath catch. The years hadn't been kind to it. The shutters hung crooked, paint peeled from the wood siding, and moss crept along the roofline. Yet it stood, worn, weathered, and waiting. She parked the car and stepped out, the cool forest air wrapping around her like a familiar, uninvited guest. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes roam across the porch where her father used to sit with his coffee, the dock where she'd learned to swim, the windows that had once glowed with warm light. It was strange how a place could be both a sanctuary and a graveyard. Claire walked up the steps, the boards creaking beneath her feet. She ran a hand along the railing, feeling the splinters and the weight of everything unsaid. This place held her past like a tightly closed book, and now, page by page, it was opening again. She reached into her bag and pulled out the set of old keys. The metal was cold in her hand as she unlocked the door. It groaned on its hinges, and the scent of dust and pine and time long gone wrapped around her like a whisper. The inside looked exactly as she remembered, frozen in time. The same stone fireplace, the same old armchair in the corner, a faded blanket still draped over it like someone had meant to come back. Her mother's easel still stood near the window, though the canvas on it had long since yellowed. Claire closed her eyes. She wasn't just here to check on the property. She was here to see if she could still stand in this house without breaking, to see if she could breathe the same air and not be pulled under by the weight of everything she lost. Somewhere in the quiet, she heard a voice in her mind, her mother's laughter, soft and melodic. It wasn't real, but it was enough. Claire opened her eyes and whispered to the empty room, "I come home." And in that moment, with the lake stretching out beyond the trees and the silence pressing gently against the walls, she took her first step not just back into a house, but into a past that refused to stay buried. The sun was just beginning to stretch over the rooftops of Maple Hollow when Jake Walker unlocked the doors to his modest garage. The familiar scent of motor oil and sun-warm rubber greeted him like an old friend. He wiped his hands on a worn rag tucked into his back pocket, then flipped the sign on the door from closed to open. Jake wasn't a complicated man. He liked the feel of tools in his hands, the satisfaction of a fixed engine, and the quiet rhythm of his days. His garage sat on the edge of town, nestled between an old diner and a field of wildflowers that Sophie liked to run through when school let out. Inside, shelves lined with parts and jars of screws were kept in perfect order. Jake believed in structure. It kept things from falling apart. It was how he managed life after losing Maria, his wife, 3 years ago. He didn't talk about it much, not because he didn't feel it, but because he felt it too deeply. Every morning, Jake woke up before the sun, packed Sophie's lunch, braided her long brown hair as best he could, and walked her to the school bus. Every evening, they sat on the porch eating sandwiches, watching the sky change colors. They were a team, just the two of them, and that was enough. Sophie was the light in his life, curious, kind, always asking questions that made him pause. Like, do clouds ever get tired? Or, why do people cry when they're happy? She had Maria's smile, and sometimes when she laughed just right, Jake had to look away to keep from falling apart. That afternoon, Jake was hunched under the hood of a pickup when the phone rang. He wiped his hands on his jeans and picked it up. "Walker's Auto," he said. There was a pause before a voice came through, soft but clear. "Hi, I'm looking for someone who does restoration work. Not just cars. A cottage, actually." Jake raised an eyebrow. "That's not usually my line of work, but I've done plenty of carpentry. What kind of restoration?" "A full one," the woman said. "It's old, very old. Need someone reliable." He could hear something behind her words. Hesitation, maybe even sadness. "Where is it?" he asked. "Blue Fern Lake." Jake paused. That was a ways out, quiet, remote, and rarely visited except by summer tourists. He hadn't been out there in years. Most people who owned property by the lake had long since stopped coming. "You own the place?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It was my family's. I I haven't been back in a long time." He looked out the garage window. Sophie was in the backyard, playing fetch with their golden retriever, Max. Her laughter rang through the air, bright, alive, the kind of sound that made the world feel okay, even if it wasn't. He needed the work. Winter was coming, and the roof needed repairs. The heating bill would double. Sophie was growing like a weed and needed new boots again. "I could come by tomorrow morning to take a look," he finally said. The woman's voice softened. "That would be wonderful, thank you." He hung up the phone, still holding it in his hand long after the line went dead. There was something about her voice, familiar in a way he couldn't place. Jake didn't know her, not really. But something about this job didn't feel like just another paycheck. Something about it felt like the beginning of something he hadn't seen coming. The early morning fog still lingered over Blue Fern Lake as Jake's truck rumbled down the dirt path, toolbox rattling in the back seat. He slowed when the cottage came into view, tucked between tall pines with the lake just visible beyond. He parked under a leaning birch and took a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. The stillness of this place wasn't something he was used to. In Maple Hollow, even silence had a hum. Crickets, distant chatter, the hum of life. Here it felt heavier, more deliberate. The cottage stood weathered and weary. The porch sagged slightly, windows dulled by years of dust and grime. Still, it had a kind of strength to it, like a person who'd endured more than they let on. As he stepped out of the truck, the front door opened. Claire Bennett stood on the porch, arms folded across her chest. She wore jeans and a faded navy sweater, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. She wasn't what Jake expected. He'd imagined someone older, maybe uptight, maybe polished. But the woman before him looked ordinary, and somehow not at all. "You must be Jake," she said, her voice soft but steady. He nodded, walking up the path. "And you're Claire." She extended a hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady but guarded, like someone constantly bracing for impact. "Nice place," he said dryly, glancing at the warped porch steps. Claire gave a quiet laugh. "It has potential." Jake looked past her toward the lake. The trees mirrored perfectly in the still water. There was something about this place, peaceful, but also unfinished, like it had been waiting for someone to come back. He got straight to work, kneeling near the porch steps. He ran his fingers along the wood, testing its strength, or lack thereof. "This'll need replacing," he said, brushing dirt off his hands. "Rot set in all the way through. Probably some damage under the structure, too." Claire nodded. "I figured." He glanced up at her. "How long's it been since someone lived here?" She hesitated, just for a second. But Jake noticed. "A while," she said. He didn't press. Wasn't his style. If people wanted to talk, they would. All right, he said, standing. I'll check the rest. The roof looks like it hasn't seen a hammer in a decade, and if the plumbing's original, it's probably a mess. Claire followed him inside, and Jake took in the space. Dim, dusty, but full of character. Vaulted ceilings, old wooden beams, a fireplace that had seen better days. But it was the little things that caught his eye. Books still on the shelves, blankets folded neatly on the couch. This place hadn't been abandoned. Not really, just left behind. He turned to her. You said this was your family's place? Claire's eyes lingered on the fireplace. Yes, my parents built it. Jake studied her face. There was something there, a tightness in her jaw, a shadow in her eyes. But she didn't offer more, and he didn't ask. Instead, he said, I'll do what I can to bring it back to life. And for the first time since they'd met, Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and her voice when she spoke was quieter. Thank you. Jake nodded, grabbing his notebook and heading outside to take more notes. He'd worked with all kinds of clients, demanding, indifferent, and everything in between. But Claire Bennett didn't fit any mold. She didn't talk much, didn't boast or condescend. She watched him work like someone who was trying to remember how to feel safe again. And Jake, though he couldn't explain why, felt something settle in his chest. This wasn't going to be just another job. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm that neither Claire nor Jake had expected. Jake arrived each morning with his toolbox in hand and a nod that said more than words. He went straight to work, measuring, inspecting, rebuilding. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer small talk unless Claire invited it, and that, oddly enough, made her feel more comfortable. Claire kept her distance at first, unsure how to exist in this space again, much less share it with someone else. But each time Jake climbed the porch steps or opened a creaking door, she found herself watching from the corner of the room, her arms folded, her heart strangely calm. By the fourth day, she started bringing him coffee. Nothing fancy, just black, hot, strong. Jake took it with a soft thank you and a small smile. Porch is nearly solid again, he said one morning, wiping his hands as he stood from beneath the steps. Should hold through the winter now. Claire nodded. It always creaked. Even when I was little, I used to think it was trying to tell us something. Jake glanced up at her, half grinning. What do you think it was saying? She paused. Maybe. I'm still standing. He liked that answer. Inside the cottage, Jake worked on the fireplace next. The stones had loosened, and the grout was beginning to crumble. As he crouched near the hearth, Claire lingered nearby, tracing her fingers along a windowsill that overlooked the lake. My dad built this fireplace, he said after a long silence. He said as long as it stayed warm, the house would always feel like home. Jake looked over his shoulder. Did it? She hesitated. For a while. He didn't press. Each day brought small, unexpected moments like this. Claire, once reserved, began offering short glimpses into her past. Not full stories, just fragments. A memory about her mother painting near the window. A birthday spent on the dock. Her father teaching her to skip stones across the lake. All said quietly, like she wasn't sure if they still belonged to her. One afternoon, Jake found her in the living room, flipping through a box of old photographs. He didn't interrupt, but when she looked up, she asked softly, Did you grow up in Maple Hollow? Born and raised, he replied, settling into a nearby chair. Never saw much reason to leave. Ever think about it? Jake took a breath. After Maria passed, I thought maybe I should. Start over somewhere. But Sophie, she needed something steady. So did I. Claire nodded slowly, then looked down at a photo in her hands, her parents arm in arm, smiling beside the lake. I think I came back to find something steady too. I just didn't realize how unsteady I'd become. Jake said nothing at first, then gently, sometimes coming back is the only way forward. The cottage, once silent and heavy, began to feel a little different. There were still shadows, still echoes, but there was also light again, tiny, flickering, but growing. Claire began sketching in the evenings, sitting by the same window where her mother used to paint. The pencil felt awkward in her hand at first, but the lines came back, slowly, shakily, but truthfully. Jake noticed. He didn't say anything about it, just smiled when he saw the pages piling up beside her bag. They were still strangers in many ways, carrying separate griefs, walking separate paths. But somewhere between the sanding of floorboards and the sharing of quiet coffee mornings, those paths had started to run side by side. And though neither of them would have admitted it out loud, something was beginning to shift, not just in the house, but in them. The wind picked up earlier than expected. By late afternoon, the sky had dimmed to a strange, muted gray. Trees rustled with warning, and the air carried that unmistakable heaviness that comes just before a storm breaks loose. Jake stood on the ladder near the cottage roof, hammer in hand, squinting at the clouds rolling in. He muttered to himself, then climbed down, wiping sweat from his brow. Claire stepped out onto the porch just as the first drops of rain tapped against the wood. "You should head back," she said, looking up at the sky. "It's coming in fast." Jake glanced toward the winding dirt road that led through the forest. "I've driven through worse." She didn't reply, but her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Something in her eyes made him pause. Then, as if on cue, the sky cracked open. The rain came hard, sheets of water pounding against the roof, thunder shaking the windows. Jake's truck was already soaked, and the road back to Maple Hollow would be a mess in minutes. "All right," he sighed, accepting the obvious. "Looks like I'm staying." Claire blinked. There's a couch, if you want." He gave a short nod. "Better than a truck seat." Inside, the cottage glowed with a quiet warmth. Claire lit a fire in the old stone hearth, while Jake toweled off near the door. She handed him a dry flannel shirt from a box marked Dad's Things. It was slightly too big, worn soft with age. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She gave a small smile. "He'd want someone to wear it." "Suena." They sat in the living room, the fire crackling between them, shadows flickering across the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling, rain beating relentlessly against the windows. But in here, it felt oddly still. Claire held a mug of tea between her hands, staring into the flames. Jake leaned back on the couch, one leg stretched out, quiet. "I haven't had company in years," she said suddenly, voice barely above the storm. Jake looked over. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She gave a soft laugh. "Not bad, just unfamiliar." The silence between them lingered, not uncomfortable, but thick with things unsaid. After a moment, Claire set her mug down and spoke, not looking at him. "My mother died here." Jake didn't move. "She and my father were arguing. I was 16. I don't even remember what it was about anymore. Something small, probably. But she left the house that night, said she needed air. It had just rained. The dock was wet. She slipped. Her voice cracked, and she inhaled sharply. "I found her," she whispered. "I ran to get my dad, but it was too late." Jake sat up slowly. "Claire, I blame myself," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "And I think maybe he did too. He never said it, but something between us broke that night." Jake didn't reach for her, didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. Instead, he said gently, "You were a kid. That wasn't your fault." Claire nodded, but her jaw trembled. "I've told myself that 100 times. Never quite stuck." They sat in silence, the fire snapping softly between them. Outside, the thunder faded to distant rumbles. The rain slowed to a whisper. Jake leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I lost Maria 3 winters ago. She was sick. The kind of sick where you know what's coming, but it still hits you like a freight train. Claire looked at him, surprised. He rarely spoke of his past. She was the strong one, he continued, the one who made everything feel like it was going to be okay. And when she was gone, I didn't know how to breathe, let alone raise a kid. A pause. But Sophie, she saved me. Every day, just by being there. Claire swallowed. You talk about her like she's your whole world. Jake gave a small smile. She is. For the first time since he arrived, Claire saw something behind his quiet steadiness, a depth shaped by loss, by love, by learning to keep going when everything inside says stop. Do you ever feel like you're just pretending? She asked. Like you're putting on a version of yourself that looks put together, but inside you're still lost? Jake nodded. Almost every day, but I figure pretending's just practice for believing it someday. Claire let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half relief. They stayed by the fire long after the rain had stopped. Claire talked about her mother's paintings, how she used to sit by the window and hum while she worked. Jake told her how he learned to braid Sophie's hair by watching YouTube videos at 2 a.m. They talked like people who didn't know if they'd ever get this kind of night again. Eventually, Claire yawned and stood. You should get some sleep, she said. The couch is yours. Jake nodded. Thanks. As she walked down the hallway toward her room, she paused. Jake? Yeah? She hesitated, then said softly, I'm glad you got stuck here tonight. Jake watched her disappear into the shadows of the hall, and though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he knew one thing as he lay down on the old couch with the scent of wood smoke in the air. This place had changed something, and maybe so had she. The morning after the storm was unusually still, the kind of quiet that felt like the world had pressed pause. Claire stood barefoot in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, eyes fixed on the lake outside. The surface was like glass, undisturbed, mirroring the towering pines that lined its shore. For a brief moment, it looked exactly as it had all those years ago, before everything changed. Last night's conversation with Jake still echoed in her chest, soft, unfinished. She had spoken words she hadn't let herself think in years. And somehow, instead of feeling drained, she felt lighter. Not healed, not yet, but maybe for the first time. She believed it was possible. She was still staring out the window when she heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. Not Jake's truck. This was heavier, slower, purposeful. Claire's heart dropped. She set her mug down and walked to the front door, her breath catching as a sleek black SUV rolled into view. The windows were tinted, the vehicle spotless even after the storm. It came to a smooth stop just outside the porch. The driver's door opened, and just like that, the past stood in front of her. Ethan Bennett. Her older brother stepped out in a navy suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of pine trees and lake mist. He adjusted his cufflinks like he was about to step into a boardroom, not onto the front steps of a memory he'd long since abandoned. Claire stood frozen on the porch, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest. Claire, Ethan said, his voice as smooth and calculated as ever. You're not answering your phone. I know, she replied flatly. He took a few steps closer, surveying the cottage with a look of barely disguised distaste. You've really made yourself hard to find. That was the idea. Ethan stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. His eyes scanned her hair tied loosely back, her sweater a little wrinkled, the smudge of charcoal still faint on her fingertips from last night's sketching. You look different, he said. I feel different. Before Ethan could respond, the screen door creaked open behind her. Jake stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth, clearly unaware of what or who was waiting. Morning, he said casually. Then he saw Ethan. The two men exchanged a brief glance. Ethan didn't bother hiding the flicker of judgment in his eyes. And you are? Ethan asked, his voice clipped. Jake Walker, Jake replied, calm but firm. I'm working on the house. Ethan looked back at Claire. Of course. So this is what you've been doing? Hiding out in Dad's old cottage with a handyman? Claire stepped down the porch steps, closing the space between them. This isn't hiding. This is me choosing peace. Peace? Ethan scoffed. You walked away from a company, from responsibilities, from everything our parents built. Claire cut him off. No, Ethan, I walked away from you, from a life I never chose. You think just because you managed the accounts and gave the speeches that the legacy was yours to control? I preserved it, Ethan snapped. You ran. Claire's voice dropped, steadier than she felt. I ran because staying meant losing the last pieces of myself. There was silence. Jake stepped off the porch and stood beside her, not imposing, just present. Solid, a quiet shield. Ethan's eyes flicked between them. So what's the plan now? Stay out here forever? Paint? Play house? Jake opened his mouth, but Claire lifted a hand, stopping him. No, she said, stepping forward. The plan is to take back what's mine. The cottage, my part of the estate, and my name, on my terms. Ethan's face changed, just slightly. Enough for Claire to see it, the twitch of his jaw, the flicker of frustration behind his eyes. He was losing control, and he didn't like it. You don't know what you're doing, he said, lowering his voice. I know exactly what I'm doing, she replied, for the first time in years. He took another step forward, voice dropping. This is about Mom, isn't it? Claire froze. I know what this place means, he continued. I know what happened that night broke you. She felt the sting of his words, sharp and cruel in their precision. You think I don't carry it too? He pressed. You think it didn't change everything for me? Then why did you bury it? She asked, her voice rising. Why did you pretend nothing happened? Why did you move on like it was a business transaction, something to close and forget? Ethan didn't answer. Claire took a breath, her voice trembling but firm. I've lived with that night every single day. I blame myself. I carried the silence, the guilt. But I'm done. She looked toward the cottage, then toward Jake. I came back because this is the only place I've ever felt real. I came back to reclaim it, and I won't let you take it from me again. Ethan's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Claire said, lifting her chin, but it's mine to make. For a long moment he stood there. Then without another word he turned and walked back to his SUV. Claire didn't move until the sound of tires on gravel faded into nothing. Then she exhaled. Her shoulders dropped. Jake stood beside her, quiet, watching her. You all right? He asked gently. Claire didn't speak for a moment. Then, no, she said, but I think I'm getting there. Jake nodded slowly. He'll come back. I know, she whispered, but so will I. They walked back toward the cottage, toward the life she was finally beginning to fight for. The next morning, Claire stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself as mist curled across Blue Fern Lake. The memory of Ethan's visit still lingered like a shadow at the edge of her mind. But this time, she didn't let it consume her. She had a choice, and she was done surrendering it. Jake arrived just after sunrise, as usual, his truck rolling up the familiar path. But today she met him before he reached the steps. I need to go into town, she said simply. He studied her face, sensing something different, calm but purposeful. You sure you want to do that today? Claire nodded. It's time. Jake didn't argue. He just reached into the truck bed, grabbed his jacket, and said, Then I'm driving. The road to Maple Hollow felt shorter than she remembered. Or maybe it was just that she wasn't running away from it anymore. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, fingers curled loosely in her lap, eyes fixed on the shifting landscape outside. She had avoided this place for years, not the buildings or the streets, but the memories attached to them. Now she was driving straight into them, and she wasn't alone. Their first stop was the bank. It was a modest building with a red brick exterior and a heavy oak door Claire had walked through countless times as a child, clutching her father's hand. Now she pushed it open herself, her shoulders straight, her chin high. The branch manager, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and thinning hair, looked up from behind his desk and froze. "Ms. Bennett?" Claire nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Avery." He stood adjusting his glasses. "I wasn't expecting—" "I know," she said, "but I'm here now, and I need your help." Jake waited in the corner, quiet while Claire laid out her intentions. A full audit of her inheritance, immediate transfer of her portion of the estate into a private trust, and legal protections against any unauthorized access from Montgomery Holdings, Ethan's company. Mr. Avery hesitated. "Your brother, he's been very active in the accounts. He claimed you were unreachable, that he was acting on your behalf." Claire's voice was calm. "Well, you can let him know I've returned, and he no longer is." Jake didn't say much, but she could feel the weight of his support beside her. Like a pillar she didn't have to lean on, but could if she needed to. When the paperwork was done, Mr. Avery offered a tight, respectful smile. "I'm glad you came in, Ms. Bennett. Your father would have wanted you to see this through." Claire paused. "So would my mother." As they left the bank, Jake walked a step behind her, watching as she exhaled long and slow. A release. "You handled that well," he said. "I had to," she replied. "For too long I let everyone else decide what I should do, what I should feel. Not anymore." They crossed the street toward the general store, but a voice stopped her cold. "Claire?" She turned to see a woman standing on the sidewalk, holding a paper bag filled with groceries. Her hair was silver now, but her eyes hadn't changed. Sharp, observant, knowing. "Mrs. Callahan," Claire breathed. The woman stepped closer, her smile warm but cautious. "You look just like your mother." Claire swallowed. "I didn't expect to see you." "I imagine you didn't," Mrs. Callahan replied. "But I'm glad you're here." Claire was still trying to decide what to say when the older woman added, "Ethan stopped by, said you were confused, that you needed time." Claire clenched her jaw. "Of course he did." Mrs. Callahan touched her arm gently. "He's worried, but he's also controlling. Always has been." Claire blinked. The honesty caught her off guard. "You were always the quiet one," the woman continued, "but not weak. I remember that about you. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Claire. Not even to him." Claire felt her throat tighten, but she nodded. "Thank you." When she and Jake got back into the truck, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was thoughtful, empowering. As the cottage came into view again, the lake glittered under the midday sun. The same house, the same trees, but everything felt changed. Claire turned to Jake as he shifted the truck into park. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her, one brow raised. "For what?" "For not asking me to explain, for showing up, and for not letting me go alone." Jake gave a small smile. "You didn't need someone to save you, Claire. You just needed someone to stand still when everything else tried to pull you back." She held his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm finally ready for what's next." Jake nodded. "Good, because something tells me this place isn't done with you yet." Claire looked toward the lake, toward the cottage her parents built, and finally, truly felt it. This was hers, her past, her story, her beginning again. The late morning sun filtered through the trees, casting delicate patterns on the porch where Claire sat, sketchbook resting on her knees though the page remained blank. She watched as Jake tightened the last bolt on a railing he'd just finished repairing. His focus was steady, movements purposeful. There was something calming about watching him work, like the world slowed down just a little when he was around. Claire hesitated, then spoke softly. "You mentioned your daughter loves the outdoors." Jake looked up, squinting slightly against the light. "Yeah, Sophie's part explorer, part question machine." Claire smiled. "Maybe she'd like to visit the lake sometime. There's a little magic here I think a kid like her would appreciate." Jake's eyes softened. "You sure?" "I am," Claire nodded. It's quiet, but not lonely. It might be nice to have a bit of laughter echoing off these trees again. Huey gave her a long look, one filled with something unspoken, then said, she'd be thrilled. And she was. When Jake returned the next afternoon, Sophie tumbled out of the truck with the kind of energy only a child could carry. Her brown ponytail bounced as she ran toward the dock, arms wide open like she might take off into the sky. Claire met her halfway, crouching slightly. "Hi, Sophie," she greeted warmly. Sophie blinked up at her. "Dad said you live by the lake now? That's so cool. Do you ever see deer or bears?" Claire laughed. "No bears, thankfully, but a few deer, yes. Maybe you'll spot one." The bond between them formed easily, as if something quiet and natural had always been waiting to connect. Claire showed Sophie the best skipping stones along the shore, and together they raced pine cones downstream, cheering when theirs didn't get stuck. Jake watched from a distance at first, arms crossed loosely over his chest, a smile tugging at his lips. That afternoon, as they sat under the old maple tree with their legs dangling from the dock, Sophie turned to Claire. "Have you ever been to the Lantern Festival?" Claire shook her head. "Not since I was little." "You have to come," Sophie said, eyes wide. "It's my favorite day of the year. Everyone writes wishes and lets lanterns float into the sky. It's like the stars get company for a night." Claire's heart clenched in the best way, the kind of ache that comes when something lost begins to return. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you for inviting me." That evening, the town square glowed beneath strings of golden lights swaying gently in the breeze. The scent of cinnamon and apples drifted from the stalls, laughter bubbling from children darting between hay bales and warm cider stands. Claire, walking between Jake and Sophie, felt like she was stepping into a memory, but this one was hers to write. When they reached the lake, townsfolk gathered in quiet anticipation, each holding delicate paper lanterns. Claire accepted hers with reverence, the soft glow from the candle inside flickering against the fabric. Jake knelt beside Sophie, helping her scrawl a wish in bold letters across the side of her lantern. "There," she said proudly, holding it up. "Think it'll work?" Jake smiled. "Only one way to find out." Claire, meanwhile, traced her fingers along the edge of hers, unsure what to write. She thought of her mother, of the years she'd lost to silence and fear, of this new thread of connection that had found its way into her life, fragile but real. Finally, she lifted her lantern, her wish unspoken but clear. When the first lanterns took flight, the crowd gasped. Dozens of glowing lights floated gently upward, casting golden reflections on the water below. Claire stood in awe, her eyes tracking the dance of flickers against the night sky. A small hand reached up and slipped into hers. Claire looked down. Sophie stood beside her, solemn and steady. "You look like you needed someone," she said simply. Claire couldn't find the words, so instead she knelt down, wrapped Sophie in a soft hug and whispered, "Thank you for being here." Her voice cracked, but her heart felt whole. Jake watched them from just behind, his chest tightening. In that quiet moment, something unspoken settled into place, like puzzle pieces finding where they belonged. As the last lanterns rose, Claire leaned closer to Sophie. "What did you wish for?" Sophie grinned. "For Max to stop stealing my socks." Claire burst out laughing, and even Jake joined in, shaking his head. "That's the most hopeless wish of the night." "But it's mine," Sophie said defiantly, and Claire couldn't help but admire her certainty. Later, as they walked back to the truck under a sky filled with floating wishes, Claire lingered a few steps behind, her gaze soft. Jake glanced over. "You all right?" She nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to, because some nights don't ask for grand declarations or perfect endings. Some nights just offer a little light, a little laughter, and a quiet, beautiful beginning. The lanterns had long since disappeared into the night sky, leaving behind only their glow in people's memories. Most of the crowd had drifted away, hands tucked into pockets, cheeks flushed from cider and laughter. The music softened, fading into something slow and wistful as the last of the festival wound down. Claire stood beneath a string of warm lights in the town square, watching as couples swayed gently to the melody. Her eyes followed the movement, not with envy, but with quiet longing, an ache she hadn't known was still there. Jake appeared beside her, his presence so familiar now it didn't startle her. He didn't speak, just stood for a moment, watching the same dance she did. Then without fanfare, he held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said softly. Claire blinked, her instinct to retreat rising, but only for a second. Something in his eyes, gentle, steady, inviting, reached past every wall she'd built. "I'm not much of a dancer," she murmured. Jake's voice was warm. "Doesn't matter. Just this once. No expectations, no pretending. Just be here." Claire hesitated, then slowly slipped her hand into his. His palm was calloused and warm, grounding. He pulled her gently into the center of the square, into the spill of golden light beneath the trees. As they began to move, Claire's breath steadied, her body slowly remembering how to trust being this close to someone. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Jake's hand rested lightly on her waist, hers on his shoulder, their joined hands held just between them. It wasn't perfect or practiced. It wasn't about steps or rhythm. It was about presence, about choosing to be in this moment with each other. Claire let her head rest near his shoulder, her eyes closing for just a second. She didn't feel like someone returning anymore. She felt like someone arriving. After a while, the music faded into the hush of evening. Jake didn't pull away right away, and neither did she. They stood close, the silence between them full of everything they hadn't yet said. When she finally looked up, Jake was already watching her. "So," he said quietly, "you think you'll stick around?" Claire tilted her head, a slow smile forming. "I think I finally found my way home." And under the soft sway of lantern light, as the last notes of music danced through the trees, Jake leaned forward. He kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't uncertain. It was honest. And when they pulled apart, Claire didn't feel lost or scared or broken. She felt ready. 1 year later, the cottage on Blue Fern Lake stood stronger than ever. The once weary beams now gleamed under fresh stain. The porch had been rebuilt with care, and wildflowers bloomed freely along the stone path. It wasn't just a house restored, it was a life reborn. Claire stood in the doorway that spring morning, coffee in hand, watching the wind dance through the trees. Birds chirped, their song familiar now, as if the forest had accepted her return. Though Jake no longer came every morning with a toolbox, he and Sophie visited almost every weekend. They had long since stopped knocking before entering. The cottage had become part of them, just as they had become part of her. Sophie brought energy into every room. She filled the walls with laughter, ran barefoot across the porch, and named every chipmunk in the woods. She had taken to the cottage like it had always been hers, and in many ways it had. Her presence made it feel more alive than Claire could have imagined, like light spilling into corners that had stayed dark for too long. Over the course of that year, something deeper grew between the three of them. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and natural, like the lake returning to stillness after a breeze. Jake's touches became more tender, his glances longer. Claire no longer second-guessed the way her heart warmed when he laughed, or when his hand brushed against hers during dinner. They'd never spoken aloud of what they were building, but everyone who visited could see it. Everyone, especially Sophie. One golden afternoon, Claire sat beside the girl on the dock, their feet dangling just above the water. Sophie was telling a long, winding story about a turtle she was convinced was following her. Claire chuckled, then fell quiet. Can I tell you a secret? Sophie's eyes widened. I love secrets. Claire smiled, a little nervous. I think I really like your dad. Sophie tilted her head, considering the words with the seriousness of a diplomat. Like, Claire laughed. Yes, like. Sophie squinted at the water, then looked back at Claire, her tone thoughtful. Then why don't you just become my mom already? Claire blinked. What? You love my dad. You love me. You make the best pancakes. It's kind of obvious, Sophie said matter-of-factly. You could live with us, or we live here. Either way, you get to be with us all the time. Claire was still trying to form words when Sophie grinned. Wait, I'll help you ask him. We'll make a plan. I'll be the surprise. Claire blinked, stunned, and then burst into laughter. It wasn't how she'd imagined a proposal would start, but maybe that was exactly why it felt so right. 2 weeks later, with Sophie's help, Claire put the plan in motion. The lake shimmered with late spring sun. Claire had packed a picnic, Jake's favorite, and set up a blanket near the water's edge. Sophie insisted on wearing a dress and had been sworn to secrecy, though she kept dropping not-so-subtle hints all afternoon. When Jake arrived, his boots crunching softly on the path, he looked at Claire and smiled in that quiet, heart-melting way of his. I'm guessing this isn't just about sandwiches, he teased. Claire stood, hands slightly trembling, heart pounding in her chest. Sophie gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up from behind a bush. Claire took a deep breath, stepped forward and reached for Jake's hand. I spent a long time running from things, she said, from people, from places, from myself. But then I found this lake again, and I found you, and Sophie. Jake didn't speak, his eyes fixed on hers. I didn't know how much I needed this, how much I needed both of you, until I couldn't imagine my life without you. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple silver band. I never planned on this. I never planned on falling in love again, especially not here. But I did. With you. With Sophie. With this life. So... Claire's voice trembled slightly as she opened the small box. Will you marry me? Jake blinked once. Twice. And then he laughed, full and warm, as tears welled in his eyes. Claire Bennett, he whispered, I thought I'd never be loved like this again. Yes, of course, yes. Sophie exploded from behind the bush, cheering louder than a football crowd. I told you he'd say yes. They married 3 months later, beneath the very tree where Jake had first kissed her. The whole town came, neighbors, friends, even Mrs. Callahan, who gave Claire a bouquet of wild daisies with a wink. Sophie stood proudly as the flower girl and declared herself the reason for everything. It was the truest thing anyone said that day. 2 years later, the cottage hadn't changed much, but their family had. Claire sat on the porch swing, a baby nestled in her arms. Little Emily, dark-haired, wide-eyed, full of wonder. Sophie knelt on the grass nearby, showing her baby sister how to blow dandelion fluff into the wind. I'm the big sister, she announced proudly, and it's the best job ever. Claire gently set baby Emily down onto the soft grass. The toddler giggled and stumbled toward Sophie, arms outstretched. Sophie knelt and took her little sister's hand, laughing. Come on, Emily, let's chase the sun. Claire smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Jake stepped up beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. They stood together, watching their daughters chase light across the lawn. No fancy promises, no big speeches, just love. Steady, growing, real. And as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting golden light over the water, Claire leaned her head on Jake's shoulder. This, she whispered, is home. Jake kissed her temple. Always. And beneath the soft hush of the breeze, the laughter of 2 little girls echoed across the lake, full of everything they'd built, everything they'd become, and everything still yet to come.